I'd like to talk some about knowing God. You know, when we look out the window, we see creation. It speaks to us. And Scripture tells us that creation, all of creation, declares the glory of God. And in the first chapter of the book of Romans, in verse 20, it says that since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead. So, we've grown up, I can say mostly, thinking about coming to know God through his word. And that's true. We know about God through his word. But I'd like to put a very interesting thought and perspective out for us to consider. And tell you a story. Perhaps you know who Helen Keller was, a woman who was deaf and blind, unable to communicate, unable to receive messages from the world. And she had a teacher who worked with her and finally found a way to communicate with Helen. She then proceeded to tell her the gospel and who the Messiah was. And Helen's response was, of course she said it was Yeshua, Jesus. And Helen said, oh, that's his name. She had never read the Bible, but she knew this person without knowing his name. You know, in the early days, going back in history, when the Bible was written in Hebrew, there were no nekudot, there were no symbols and vowels under the letters. And there were no spaces between the letters. So obviously, if there are no spaces between the letters, it's somewhat difficult to decide where a word begins and ends. So how would you know? Of course, there are going to be situations when you'd say, if this letter is with this word, it means that. Or if this is with that word, it means something else. Well, how do you know? And how do you discern? And how do you read it? And how do you understand? You see, when we read the Scripture, we hear the words in our own mind, according to our mindset and according to our own personal orientation and thoughts about God. But what we see in the story with Helen Keller and what we see in the Scriptures that even tell us about the creation declaring the glories of God, it speaks to us about which aspect is primary. You see, do we understand about God and come to know him personally, ultimately by just reading the Word? Yes, it can lead us to him. But I would suggest that our understanding of the Word comes from our knowing him. And knowing him beyond our intellect, beyond the limitations of our mind, but experiencing him in our spirit. So that when we see things happening, when we hear things, when somebody speaks in his name, for example, something in our spirit says, it doesn't fit because I know his nature and this doesn't fit along with it. So, beloved, we need to know him personally, intimately, spirit to spirit, and then we will understand his word and truly know how to walk.